You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is Season 3, Episode 10, Deb. I'm your host, Haley Radke. I usually get right to the heart of the show, but today I need 2 extra minutes to celebrate with you, and then we'll get right to an incredible interview. I mean, this one is a gem, so stick with me. Listen to this. This is my 50th episode of Adoptees On. I can't even believe it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing the show. And some days, friends, especially lately, your words of encouragement that you email or tweet or DM me, those things are keeping me going. I'd love to have your help to celebrate the big 5-0 with me. And I have some ideas of how we can do that together. So I'm going to mention that at the end of the show. Now, I know some of you like a little behind the scenes info, and so here are some fun stats for you. The show has been downloaded over 65,000 times and in 75 countries. The top downloads are from the US, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, Sweden, China, and Denmark. Hi, friends. So far away. I can't even believe it. So amazing. I live in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. If you ever want to check out where that is, go into Google and check it out. And the last fun fact for you, what is the most downloaded episode ever? Do you have a guess? It is the Season 2 finale with Jasenia of IamAdopted.net, which, of course, is such an amazing guest. Okay, also, Adoptees On was recently accepted on Spotify. So now you can listen right in your Spotify app or Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or on YouTube, Facebook, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Thank you for indulging me with this little celebration, friends, and let's get on with the show. Deb Sivany, a designer and newly a playwright, shares about when she started connecting the dots of the impact adoption has had on her life and how design and writing her play, Hello, My Name Is, has helped her process her adoptee experience. We wrap up with recommended resources, and links to all of the things we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to the show today, Deb Sivany. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. I would love it if you would start out by sharing your story with us.
Guess we can start at the very beginning, as most stories go, or at least the beginning that I know. I was born in 1978 in Seoul, South Korea, and adopted at the age of 5 months. And I was adopted by a family in Connecticut, in very rural Connecticut, a little town called Durham, where pretty much grew up in isolation. You know, I knew a couple other Asians in town, but they were, you know, you're sort of like non-adoptee Asian. I guess my mom was an immigrant from Taiwan, and so I had a mirror in her. But my dad is second generation French Canadian, so I sort of grew up in the quintessential New England experience.
Okay.
It's a very convoluted story already.
Well, I did ask you how to pronounce your name before, and you said it was French Canadian, so I was very curious where where that came from.
I know.
Can you talk a little bit about growing up in that small town?
It was a very tiny town. I went back and looked at the population a couple years ago just out of curiosity, because I'm like, I always tell people, oh, I'm from a very small town. It's pretty small, 6,000 people. And so that put that in perspective. I was like, oh, my college, you know, was half the size of that. That was a very small school. It was actually really great. You know, I grew up in the middle of the country. There were more cows than people when I was first there. And that was, I don't know, an exciting time to grow up on lots of land. Actually, I should preface this by saying I lived for a few years in Bridgeport, Connecticut, so a much more urban environment, and we moved when I was 5. So most of my formative years were spent growing up in small town Connecticut, even though the first 2 or 3 were in a city. But yeah, trees, swing sets, cows, cartwheels on the lawn. It was really pretty idyllic.
And did you have an opportunity to talk much about being adopted? Was that something that your family talked about?
I've always known I was adopted. That was never a secret hid from me or anything like that. But I don't know, it was the early 80s, so I feel like times have really changed in terms of adoption and how much people talk about adoption and interracial adoption and intercountry adoption. So I think for my parents, they were just so happy to have a child. It was just it became a very normal thing. They never backed away from my questions about adoption, but I also didn't have a lot because it just didn't seem, I never knew anything else because I had just been adopted so young. So, sort of assimilating into that world, that culture, I didn't have an alternative that I was even really aware of. I remember asking my mom, who essentially was Chinese, that can you teach me Chinese? And she was like, no, it's just too hard, and she always sort of discouraged me from that. But I think also in retrospect, I think she was also trying to figure out ways that she could assimilate and become more, quote, American in her own way. So for her daughter to say, well, Mom, I'm interested in being more Asian, I think it wasn't malicious or anything. I think she was really just trying to do her own thing. So thought, well, my daughter will be the ultimate American. She will completely assimilate and be the best American she can possibly be.
So I had on a previous show, Mike McDonald. He has a podcast that he hosts called The Rambler.
Yes, I know that.
Yeah, so he's a Korean adoptee, and he was telling me in that show about the culture camps. Did you ever go to one of those?
No, and it's ironic. Like my father asked me when I was maybe 12, 13, do you want to go to culture camp? And this was down in New Jersey and we were in Connecticut. And by that point, I was just like, no, Dad, why do I want to spend my time with Koreans? I just think it was one of those, like, we've spent so long trying to make me fit in with all these white people around me, that like, why do I want to go spend time with other Koreans, which is so, I want to go back and shake my 12-year-old self to be like, you could have started this journey like 30 years ago. But here I am now, almost 40. And now I'm like, oh, right. If I'd gone to culture camp, maybe it would have been better. Instead, I went to Christian theater camp. I developed other skills.
Well, that's perfect. Can we go there now? The adult you're wishing you had that experience. What or when did some questions about adoption or how it's impacted you? When did that sort of start happening for you?
It's funny in little ways. When I was in graduate school studying design, I knew, you want to develop sort of like an artistic voice and try to figure out what that means for you personally as an artist, even though you're working on the work of other people. As a theater artist, I'm often collaborating with many, many other people who also all have their own opinions and artistic voice. But for me, it was important that I figure out what my thing was, what I could bring to the table that no one else could. So in being an individual who was brought up amidst 2+ cultures, I sort of said, well, all of my work sort of envelops the relationship between Eastern and Western culture. And that sort of became my thing for a long time of exploration. And while I didn't at the time relate it, specifically to adoption, I absolutely, I can't deny that was one of the reasons why I'd sort of figured out, oh, this is what I'm about. And I really wasn't able to articulate until about 10 years later when I started thinking, I should really go to Korea. It was one of those like bucket list things, oh, by the time I'm 30, I'll go to Korea. Well, I didn't make it. So every couple of years, by the time I'm 35, I'm going to make it to Korea. I didn't make it then too. And then I finally went at the age of, what was that? 2015. So 37. I finally made it over there after many, probably about 10 years of saying, I'm going to go, but not even really knowing why I wanted to go. I just knew that it was something I had to resolve and something I needed to see. Yeah, that's the part that like finally kind of linked to it. But also I had like micro moments. When I was in grad school, I was also diagnosed with bipolar type 2. And I learned that is something that you inherit from your mother. And so I thought, well, gosh, my birth mother must have had, bipolar disorder. And that sort of stopped me for a moment to be like, huh, okay, I wonder if that was influential in, why I was given up. Micro moment, and then like put
Mm-hmm.
that down, move on, think about it occasionally, wonder about genetics. Every time I'd go to the doctor's office, I'd be like, well, NA, not applicable, adopted. And it just sort of becomes part of your MO through the world. So, little reminders here and there, but never a serious thought about it until I was like well into my 30s.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about going to Korea?
So I married a guy that grew up, spent most of his years growing up in Singapore, as the son of expats. It was really interesting that I am this Korean girl from Connecticut and my husband is this white guy from Singapore. So we are polar opposites. So because of that, his parents are still there and we travel there every year. The year in 2014, we were supposed to go. He had gone before me. And then I was out working on a show and I destroyed my meniscus in my knee and I couldn't go. And it was really awful. So I had this ticket that I needed to, that I'd canceled for the first trip, but then I just needed to use before the year was up. From the time we'd bought the ticket. So it was like before the following October. So I just decided to go see my in-laws the following summer and then combine it with a trip to Korea. I figured it was a sign that
Oh.
I should finally do it. It's just sort of I had to destroy my knee to do it, but it was sort of serendipitous as well.
And did you go on your own?
I did. Yeah, everybody talks about going on the tours and I feel like while there probably is a tour for older adoptees, I felt like, oh, I really need to do this by myself, which I'm glad I did. It definitely had its really, just sort of joyous and horribly disheartening moments of being there alone. It's lonely being in a country where everybody expects you to speak the language and you just don't. But it was really wonderful because I got to process it on my own. I'm pretty introverted. It was one of those times where I could just kind of walk around in silence all day and not really have to talk to people. And there's something really nice about that. So it's just a way to like do a half tourist trip. I went to the adoption agency, the whole post adoption services to look at my file. So it was also sort of part business. But yeah, I was there for 9 days and I'm raring to do it again. So
So did you start a search when you were there?
I did not. I think I'm not ready yet. I have, I requested the paperwork to start one, but I haven't filled it out.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what does not ready look like for you?
I think not ready is just that I don't know, my relationship to family generally is complicated. I think this is one of those things that is like, oh, it's an adoption issue for me that like I feel like I've never quite been a good daughter to anybody, or at least I spent all of my years growing up like trying to be a very good daughter and not being that conscious of it. But then like in my adult life, I've kind of not been great with parents and parent figures generally. I've spent a lot of time sort of pushing people away. I'm also not a parent myself by choice. So that is yeah, this is one of those things that I've sort of grappled with. So to search for my original parents, the ones that conceived me, I'm not quite sure I'm ready to grapple with everything that means.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that in a year or two, I'll have some sort of revelatory turnaround. But at the moment, I'm really just trying to sort of process internally, and then I'll be able to take it out in the next couple of years, I think.
So when you were in Korea, did you have any thoughts about them or thoughts about searching? Can you explain a little bit about the feelings of being there and like, did you feel like this is familiar? I mean, I know you were 5 months, like when you were adopted, but
I often wondered if there was going to be a moment where the language would like come back or I would recognize something or I'd be triggered by hearing some phrase or word, but none of that actually happened, which is totally okay. But I did sort of walk around wondering, are these women my mother? I'm like doing the math on, approximately how old she would be. Like she'd be young. She'd be, just under 60. So I kind of watched all the 60-year-old women, some like when I first arrived in Seoul, I'm trying to find my Airbnb, and I was in the metro, and I think this older woman thought, oh, well, she's lost. So she grabbed me by the arm and she sort of like walked me out of the metro. And I couldn't help but look at her and be like, are you my mother? This is one of those moments, like the book with the duck, and it just, yeah, it sort of kept hitting me that I was like, oh, any one of these people could be a relation. And you try, not to get too bogged down into that because that could be entirely overwhelming. But I did think often about like, oh, this person could be my mother. I didn't think so much about my birth father, who left her when I found out in my file reading. But yeah, I don't know. It's a rather surreal experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's also super surreal to be surrounded by Koreans. I've never had that in my life. Like I've traveled around Asia, but it's not the same. And to completely blend in on a street and know, wow, I do look Korean. I sort of have grown up in being sort of skeptical about it, like, oh, am I actually really half Korean or am I something else? But DNA has confirmed I'm totally Korean, and I saw my face echoed in a lot of other people's faces for the first time in my life.
You did DNA testing?
I did. I did the 23andMe.
Just for medical curiosity, or were you looking for a connection?
A little both. You always wonder about the medical thing because I feel like that's the thing that sort of strikes you all your life of like, oh, I don't know any of my medical history. So according to my DNA, I'm pretty healthy, but other than that, like not a whole lot of information given. I do know like my haplogroup and all that kind of stuff that comes with it. And I have found a couple fourth cousins. But the funny thing is so many of the people that have done the DNA testing are also other adoptees. So I'm finding other adoptees that are like my fourth cousins. I'm like, all right, well, that makes sense because that's all of us that are looking.
There's a
So
lot. There is a lot of
yeah.
you.
Hmm.
Yeah, I can't believe like the hundreds of thousands. Like it's
I know. And we're all finding each other, which is
yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
But yeah, it would be great if more people in the Korean Peninsula were taking the DNA testing as well. So
Mm-hmm. Well, from what I understand, searching in Korea, like you have to go there and their birth record system is different than
yep.
over here. And it's very complex.
Yes.
So that's why, as you were saying, there's these tours to kind of go back and start a search. And it's this whole big decision.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's so interesting. Have you connected with other Korean adoptees online or in person? What's that sort of meant to you?
Sure. That's sort of my first connection point back in 20, yeah, I guess back in 2014, I ran into this group online via Facebook called Adoption Links DC. And they do a dinner every month, and it's open to all adoptees, although it seems like majority sort of Korean and Chinese adoptees are part of this group, although there are many others. Yeah, I went to like a dinner at Banchan, and it was kind of revelatory. Went in, met a couple people, and they're like, hey, so like, what's your story? And, you give your story in a couple of sentences, and then they're like, cool, all right, well, this is chicken, and it was really lovely to not have to explain myself. I feel like I've spent my whole life explaining myself, and to finally be with a group of adoptees who just nod their heads and totally get it, and they know their stories are totally different than yours, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to like, no one tells you, oh, you're so lucky, or, oh gosh, aren't you really scared that you don't know all these things? And you're like, it's yes. The answer is always yes in these adoptee communities. But it was nice and a relief to not have to say, oh, and here's my long sob story, and you should feel sorry for me for all these reasons. Like it just was a comfortable space in ways that I think I had never really felt around a group of strangers, at least. So I've engaged with the community there in person, and then online. I'm now part of all of the major Korean adoptee Facebook groups that are going around, and then a couple other sort of transracial adoption groups. So it keeps me in both the social know and the political know with all the complexities that surround adoption, which in the beginning I had no idea it was like even a thing, that people were even mad. Like I really, as a child, I fell into the grateful adoptee category. Like I had a really great life. I went to an awesome college. I had a great childhood. Yes, there were microaggressions and racism, but like it would have been that way if I were my parents' daughter anyway. So I never really gave it a thought until all these people around me were like, I'm so mad about all these things and these laws and these rules. And I'm like, oh, wow, I'm mad too. And so now I'm doing a lot more reading about it. And yeah, there's a lot to be upset about. So I think the next couple years for me are going to be getting more involved in the activism side of adoption.
Yeah, we've recently been talking a little bit about the citizenship issue and a variety of different things that are going on right now. It's so important to be involved. So that's awesome that you're connected in those ways. Okay, is there anything else that you kind of want to talk about on this sort of side of the discussion? Because the next side, I want to talk about your work and creativity in that sort of space.
I also was able to engage with a ton of adoptees at the conference in Pittsburgh this past year. And it was epic. It was an amazing, overwhelming weekend.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What is it and how many people come and that kind of thing?
So I think the numbers might have been a little larger than this, but I think it felt about 200, 250 people, all in the adoption triangle. 80 of them, or 80 of us, were adoptees. And then it was a lot of parents and siblings and children of. And it was a 3-day conference of workshops given by people in various parts of the triangle, but a lot of space was given towards adoptee voices, which I really appreciated. The subjects ran the gamut, everything from very difficult conversations on race and social justice to what it's like to be an adopted teenager and how you get along. And some of those things were just for kids. And then there were other things that were more on the creative side and other things that were like built only for parents. There were lots of activities structured where the adoptees would speak sort of in the inner circle and then the parents would sit on the outer circle spending time listening. So this is just a really great place to say, like, right, it's important that we are heard, and it's important that our voices are heard and that we're not being talked over or replaced by our parents, which as an adult sometimes sounds ridiculous. That it's like, well, why shouldn't you be able to speak for yourself? Well, your parents' story about you and them adopting you is always going to be, their story, and you don't want that to take over your own narrative, because guess what? You were there too. So it's just a great reminder and a great community time to be with all those people.
I love that. Like fully being listened to. Oh,
yeah, it was awesome.
I want that for so many of us that feel like we've been voiceless for so long and not even known that that's where that feeling comes from.
Yeah, I know. When you get to speak, like the end of the conference, I lost it. That we were doing like a final meditation and they're like, think about someone on your left that loves you, someone on your right that loves you. And I started bawling. Like I was so good that whole weekend, having these tough conversations and like, having chats after workshops, and it was really great. And then at the end I was like, oh my God, and I just cracked. But I needed that so much because it cracked open my heart. It actually allowed me to do better work afterwards. So
let's shift and talk about that. So you are a designer, you're a theater artist. Tell me a little bit about your work.
I've been, I guess, a professional costume designer since, depends on where you call the beginning, but let's just say 2004 when I graduated from graduate school. And in the past maybe 8 years, I've been working as a scenic designer as well. I've also had small stints as a producer with my husband's theater company, Rorschach Theater here in DC. And I've also worked as a freelancer at many of the DC companies in the area. So Kennedy Center Theater for Young Audiences, Woolly Mammoth, Roundhouse, Olney, and many, many of the sort of small to mid-sized companies, Imagination Stage, Theater J, on and on and on. So I've been in the community for 17 years. It's an amazing place to grow and work and be an artist. I developed this piece. So, like two designer hats, it just wasn't enough. I was like, oh, it's costume designer and set designer. What happens if I write a play? Because I get career restless. Like I get the coolest job. I get to freelance and I get to work on a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm always working on everybody else's stuff. I never get to pick the play. I just say yes to the job. I've been part of this playwrights collective called The Welders for 2 years now. And through this playwrights collective, they brought me in originally with the intent of me designing their plays. And I said, guys, what do you think if I were to make a play? And they were all totally for it. So through that group producing it, I wrote a play, which happened to be about three Korean adoptees trying to find home. So that's sort of how I got to this crazy point. I don't know. Also, just working in a relatively small community where I know everyone, I think that is it's the best gift. That it said, "Hey guys, I'm going to write a play," and everybody around me said, "Wow, we really trust you. We're really excited." Like I don't know where else I'd be able to do that.
I had interviewed Kristen Garofo, and so she was doing a play reading, and she told me that you were hosting it, and then she started describing some of the things you were doing, and I was thinking, my goodness, this sounds so immersive. I've never heard of a play like this. So can you talk a little bit about that? What was it exactly? It seems beyond a play. I don't have a word for it.
Yeah, we were calling it, what I think in the marketing we called it a theatrical event, simply because, yeah, it felt reductive to call it a play. There are parts of it that are like a play. There are definitely parts of it that I wrote that are like a play, but a lot of it was driven by its setting. We were working in a house in Tacoma Park called Rhizome, which is an arts collective. And this arts collective has this house, which they do a lot of experimental music shows. There's some homeschooling groups and some yoga groups and women's groups and writers groups that all do their work in and around this space. I approached them and I said, "Hi, would I be able to use your house for a month to do this show? And you could still run events, but could we make a deal?" And so they were amazing to say yes. What it meant was it's actually a house. It's not even like a house that's been turned into a theater. There's no grid. It's just a literal house with rooms. And each one of those rooms became its sort of own tiny stage for a scene in the play. So audiences came in, they were greeted to a party. They came in and they pretty much found out within the first like 3 minutes of being there that it was a gotcha party, a gotcha day party. And
Ah.
I wasn't subtle about it. There's a very well-meaning white woman at the center who talked to you and gave you hot dish, and it was set in Minnesota. You were uncomfortable. I mean, it's already uncomfortable to enter into a house, be greeted by a stranger, or for some, even an actor that they knew, but playing this role, told all about this girl that was coming and how exciting that she was coming, and she was essentially, as a character, the sister of the adoptive mom. And so by placing it in that place, I was able to sort of honestly capitalize on the audience feeling awkward and make them feel more awkward. Because it's a very strange thing to walk into. And she even mentions like, "Oh, I didn't tell them you were coming, but don't worry, they're going to be thrilled." And then everyone signs this sign, and she says, "Oh, we're all going to go by the door and say surprise." And then the door pops open, and everybody else surprised because that's what they've been told to do. And it's this girl, and she is 6, and she's terrified. And there's no parents to be seen. And that's sort of where the play begins. That's sort of the inciting incident. So this girl goes upstairs, the audience follows her, and it's only 15 people. It's a very small audience. So they follow her upstairs. She finds her new room and she explores the room, and like everything in the room has been labeled, and I could keep explaining it forever and ever, but essentially it just goes from scenelet to scenelet to scenelet where we meet new characters and then we realize how they're all connected. And then eventually we watch them grow up. There's a sort of heart to heart with Aunt Rosie, who was the one who greeted us in the house, who sort of mellowed after 20 years or 15 years. And she's chatting with June. And June is like, my parents hid my adoption paperwork. What's up with that? And she's, pretty angry about it. And so we watch them have this very frank conversation, but it doesn't involve like a parental need. It's just an aunt trying to be supportive and saying, well, you're an Amundsen just like the rest of us, and you've always been one of us, June. And she's like, yeah, look at me. It was the visual playing out of a lot of that conflict. And then we meet two other so June is sort of the one caught in the middle. We meet another adoptee, Dana, who was adopted as a baby. So this is sort of part of my story, and grew up in like relative privilege, trying to be white, not really paying a whole lot of attention to her Koreanness. And that's very much a reflection of how I grew up, like always knowing I was Korean and insisting to other people I'm Korean and this is a thing, but not really knowing what it ever meant, and just wanting to be like everybody else. And then there's a third character, Brian, who sort of got knocked through the foster system. He sort of represents the uglier side of how adoption can go. And because his papers never get completed by any of the parents, he ends up getting deported. So in the second act, they all end up in Korea for various reasons. One goes on her own, one goes on a tour, and then there's Brian, who's been deported, and they all meet up at the agency and sort of rediscover each other. So yeah, it's a lot of things to describe because primarily it was visual. People spoke lines, but on the whole, in a lot of the first act, the three adoptees don't speak because we talked about being voiceless and not having a voice. That's actually what I wanted to reflect in that whole first part of the show, was the fact that their stories are being told for them, even though they're just living their lives. And then in Act 2, of course, they have a ton to say.
I am sort of speechless because it sounds so amazing. And my stomach tensed up as soon as you said it's a Gotcha Day party. Mm-hmm. And experiencing that from the eyes of an adoptee, that would be really interesting. But did you have reactions from people who don't have a connection to adoption?
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that, how they experienced it?
Yeah, it's interesting. The audiences sort of came, I don't mean to be reductive, but in three types. There were the audience members who knew something about adoption, either because they were parents or adoptees, and those were two very different groups. And I guess included in that are like the people that have like a sibling who's adopted. And then there are people who, like theater, are theater fans here in DC, maybe read the preview in the Washington Post and came because they were like, oh, well, this sounds like a cool theatrical experience that I shouldn't miss, so I should go to that. And then you had the completely random people who were like, oh, I like immersive experiences, and I really dug Sleep No More in New York, and I really want to come see this because I hear it's like that, which it wasn't. But because Sleep No More, you go around and you can sort of experience this 5-floor warehouse. It's giant. It's amazing. I have been. But you can touch things and take things away. And like we had a couple of people who tried to steal some props. That was not cool. And we guide them through very deliberately because I want them all to see the story in order.
Right.
But yeah, it's like the sort of thrill seekers came out later in the run. And then the theater fans and people who just like the Welders as a playwrights collective came out. And then, yeah, there were the people who are related to adoption somehow. I think for the uninitiated to adoption, they enjoyed the theatrical experience. This is just what they've told me. They enjoyed the theatrical experience because it was sort of unique for DC. We don't do a lot of immersive work here in the city. There's some companies who do, but on the whole, a narrative-driven immersive experiences is not something we do a whole lot of. But I think they were surprised how moved they were because they came in hearing, oh, this is about adoptees. I know nothing about that. I guess, oh, I've seen This Is Us, and maybe that's how they relate. And then they come out and they're like, oh my gosh, it's about immigrant experiences and being in unfamiliar places. And we've all felt that. We've all felt alienated in one part of our life or another, even if it's just like on the playground at school as a 7-year-old. Everybody knows what it's like to be on the outside at one point in time in their life. So I think a lot of people really, really got into it because at the core, that's what this is. It's I have not found home because I feel isolated from my world.
Oh my goodness. Sorry, you're so smart and I just love it. Okay.
I've had a long time to think about it, and I've talked about the play quite a bit too.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Can you just talk about the process of writing it, coming up with these ideas for different rooms, also integrating your personal feelings with it and any healing that's kind of come out of that?
the process of writing it began with lists. I made lots and lots of lists, honestly, on the plane home from Korea. I had this notebook, and my notebook was like my best friend. Everything went into this notebook, every thought, feeling, visual description, oral description, everything I was feeling just went into this journal in those 9 days, along with like every museum stub and brochure. It was like my own little travel scrapbook. So I carried that around with me, and then I carried it around for the next 2 years. Sort of writing down everything that struck me, every question, both about Korea and my experience, but then the stories that I had heard from others. And then it started to get full of little drawings after that, little vignettes of like, oh, I wonder what would happen if I made a visual that looked like this. And it became this sort of odd pastiche of like, drawn sketches for visual dioramas. This is before I knew I even had this house venue for the play. So it was just like I would picture things I wanted to talk about in random rooms. It was a long time before it became a play in itself. So those lists became, now I want to know more about X. So that went into research lists. So I'm like, Korean traditional houses. Well, I saw some in Bucheon when I was there, but now I really need to know, like, why are they shaped this way? And I'm just a very curious person at heart. So lists became more lists, became little sketches. And then finally, as I sort of took that trip and then came back and started talking to other adoptees to say, hey, I'm doing this play, and I just want to talk to people about their experiences. I started gathering commonalities from my experience to others, and then moments that were like the exact opposite of what I had experienced, and putting all those together and then forming characters from those experiences. So, like, my own story is sort of my touchstone. And when people ask me, where are you in the play? I'm like, oh, I'm scattered all over the place. And they're little Easter eggs. Like, people who saw the play who've known me for a long time saw my picture in one of the displays. They're like, that's you, right? I was like, yeah, it is. So I am, I'm my own story is scattered all around. And it, for me, helped me as I was writing actual scenes where people had to say things. It helped me ground it in reality. I had also surveyed many of the members of the Korean adoptee community and used some of their survey answers in sort of short excerpts of final letters that end the play of adoptees to their parents. It really became a play, honestly, like right as we were starting rehearsals. It was all super raw going into that. Like I had like a 30-page draft going in because I had to give the actors something and my directors something, but it really didn't take shape until about a week into rehearsals, as the director, who I will mention is my husband, Randy. So he's the guy that, grew up in Singapore. So he understands, I think, in a very primal way, like what it means to be a minority in a space. So it makes him a very well-suited director to the project. He also knows me super well and was able to give me criticism in ways that I could take. We actually work together a lot as artistic collaborators. I know that not every couple gets to do that or wants to do that, but he and I have worked together a lot. And earlier this year, he actually wrote a very autobiographical play that I designed. So I feel very fortunate to have him as a super artistic partner. And he's I also joke and I call him Captain Narrative. He's also the guy that helped me sort of put it into story form and tie these characters together in a much stronger way. So he was really my sort of guiding light in terms of that.
Mm-hmm. So as you were collecting these thoughts in your journal and writing different scenes and putting these pieces together and putting a lot of yourself in there, were
Mhm.
you able to process any feelings about your experience, your adoption journey, and even you had said like, oh, discovering that some adoptees are mad. Can you
Yeah.
speak to any of that?
I'll take it from the outside in. The more research that I did, because I don't mean to not answer it personally, the more research I did, the more my own story became clear. The more that I was like, oh, right. We all share strange feelings of, what if and abandonment, and we have to grapple with those things. So I think like writing the story in the play about Brian, who's the character who's deported, I haven't been deported. I'm fine. I'm still here in the States, but I have read many articles about Adam Krapser, who was deported last year. And then I met a guy who was deported when I was there in Korea. He was sort of such a fascinating guy. I just wrote down lots of things and said, maybe he'll become a character in my play. Also wondering, like, well, we have zero in common. Like we've had these sort of opposite lives. What could I possibly have in common? But oh, I'm so fascinated with this guy as a character. But I think writing the scenes for Brian, at least in the beginning, which are largely silent, they're often movement pieces, or he'll say three lines while the character who's bouncing around him is doing all of the talking, that I did realize I have quite a bit in common with Brian. That, like, after doing all this reading, I am angry about things like the baby box. I am angry about the Korean laws and how people keep breaking them. I'm mad about Korea's social services, like, and all these things manifested themselves in the character of Brian, and I'm like, oh, Brian's political views are my own. That was an interesting revelation. And in one, even though the journey of that has been frustrating because I cannot fix Korean social services, but it has sort of helped me grapple with various personal things because I just understand the system better. I appreciate that it is super complicated, and that's why these people feel the way they do. I'm able to see people's stories better and understand them better by knowing what others have been through. So it's given me more empathy. Before, I think I only had empathy for like one and a half sides of it, and now I have empathy for like six sides of it that I didn't have before. So I think that has really helped me personally in my healing, is just a greater understanding of like the adoption dodecahedron. It's not a triangle.
I've never heard that before.
I know. It's just so much more complicated than anyone gives it credit for. That,
Mhm.
they're like, oh, well, the adoption triangle. I'm like, yes, first parents, birth parents, adoptees, adoptive parents. But like the foster system is a very large part of that. And so I had a character that was a foster sister who was white, because there are more facets than I think a lot of writing gives it credit for. Like, I think if I do this play again, it'll be like 4 hours long. There's just so much more to say.
You'll need that 5-story warehouse.
I think so. Yeah, I'm ready. Cast of 40.
Well, I don't know, I'm sort of awestruck by the way you have weaved in your story and others' stories and this full experience in this house, in this play. It's incredible. And I am always trying to think of different ways to teach people what an adoptee's experience really is like and to help shift the societal narrative. And how do we do that? It's like such a huge task. You said we can't change Korean social services. It feels like this huge daunting task, but I believe that all the people that came and saw your work, something probably shifted for them. And
Mhm.
so thank you. Thank you for working to change the perception of adoption. It's so important.
Thank you. It's awesome to hear that. I mean, a lot of adoptees have expressed the same sentiment, which I don't know. I'm just trying to do my own thing. I'm glad that I can at least begin to attempt to voice the thoughts and feelings of others, and be a medium for that. But I'm so just incredibly humbled by the whole experience that I'm still, like it just closed 2 weeks ago, so I'm still kind of reeling from it.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, it's an amazing thing. And like my cast was awesome too. None of them were adoptees, but they really, really got it over the course of that rehearsal period. Granted, I gave them a ton to read, which I think a lot of them did, or at least they could have fooled me. They were really, yeah, they were super engaged on a level that was just kind of mind blowing. They blew my mind. I could not have done the play without that ensemble.
Wonderful. Well, as we move into recommended resources, which is a
Mhm.
segment we always do at the end of the show, I really want to encourage people to check out Deb's work. You have a website, and if there is going to be an opportunity in the future to see your play or to engage with some of the other creative things that you're doing, if people follow you there, they'll be able to check that out, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, okay, so we'll give all that contact info at the end of the show, and I'll of course put it in the show notes. But what did you want to recommend to us today, Deb?
All right. So I had to think long and hard about this because, like, there are many adoptee artists that I really admire. But then I was thinking about who is the biggest influencer on my work as a theater artist and a designer. And I had to go back into, like, what do I teach? Because I'm an educator at Georgetown. And one of the most exciting artists that I've discovered in the past 5 years has been Do Seo. He's a Korean American artist who makes these incredible, to talk about things that blow minds. He makes these houses out of fabric. How to even describe it? They are these transparent houses out of fabric. They are full size, and they look like giant 3D architectural blueprints. They're really beautiful and stunning. And I was able to experience one when I was in Korea, sort of bringing my whole experience full force. I almost
Mm.
like collapsed on the ground because, like, standing before this giant facade of the House of Dior, which is where I saw it. There was a big Dior exhibit, and he had created the sort of entry portal. It was just amazing. And so I went and did a little bit more research on him, and he does a lot of series about home as he's trying to reconcile his childhood home in Korea with New York apartments, LA apartments, and being in the United States. So the sort of resonance of like what home means to this super fabulous installation artist in things, he makes things that I like can't even approach. And like I'm a designer, I'm used to looking at things and being like, oh well, I could figure out how to make that. I have no idea how he does what he does. I just know that it is mind-blowing and so out of my league. So that's why I just praise it.
You sent me some links ahead of time, and I was looking at
Mhm.
the photos, and they're stunning. So
They're
I
amazing.
can't imagine being there in person and
Yeah,
experiencing it. And this huge billowing silky like houses.
I know, right? People, you should just put up the link because people need
I
to look
will.
at it. Like,
Yeah.
it's so hard to explain what it is he does. And he does other things too. Like he made this sculpture of like 1.5 inch tall people underneath plexiglass in the shape of a foot with a giant boot coming down on it, that reflects like North Korea and its people and the regime. So it's like all deeply political work too. Which I think is just really fantastic that it's work that is aesthetically beautiful and has such a distinctive voice for
Mhm.
who he is as an artist.
Well, and I love that picture that you were giving of, he's showing us home. And for us, we are always sort of looking for that and processing as adoptees. So anything you can kind of experience and that gives us some sort of emotional reaction helps us process these things, I think, in a different way. Just as your play, I'm just such a huge huge advocate for the arts and creativity and the healing that it can bring us. And so that's sort of the reason for this whole series, this theme of healing through creativity.
That's great.
Well, I thank you so much for your time. And I really could you share with us, where can we connect with you online?
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Indepenguin. So it's the @ INDEPENGUIN. It is a mashup of the two words independent and penguin. So how I view myself and my favorite bird, because I too am an awkward flightless bird. And then you can find me on Facebook. My professional page is Deborah, Debra Kim, which was my old Korean name, Sivany, Sivigny.
And your website address?
debsivany.com. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for walking us through Hello, My Name Is.
Thank you.
Wasn't she amazing? Oh my goodness. I told you she was a gem. You got to go follow her, guys, because you definitely want to see what she does next and the next time her play is presented. I mean, didn't it just sound incredible? I totally want to go sometime. Okay, so here's where my idea of how to celebrate this 50th episode comes in. If you're listening when this airs, we're just at the end of the year and you might be considering your year-end giving. I would like to ask you to find an organization that supports family preservation, either in your community or globally. My husband and I just decided this year that our year-end monetary gift as a family will be going to support an organization in my city that helps teen parents. They support them to find housing, to finish high school. They even have a daycare and practical parenting classes for both moms and dads. It's a great organization. I'd love it if you would find a local or global organization that you think is doing amazing family preservation work and support them in some way to celebrate with me. Maybe you're able to donate financially. How about $50? $500? Maybe that's super steep for you right now, but you can volunteer for them or gather up some friends and do an in-kind donation drive, like for diapers and wipes or other supplies that they might be asking for. And would you tell me about what you do? Tag me on social media so I can thank you personally for helping to keep families together. This episode has been brought to you by my incredibly generous Patreon supporters. And so I'd like to dedicate this special 50th episode to you, amazing people who believe in me so much that you are standing with me financially every single month. No words, guys, to explain how grateful I am for each of you. Sending you my love. And here's to another 50 episodes. Thank you for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.